What's up, everybody? Once again, it is I, James, coming to you from the Nerdy Mewzings Podcast studio. Today, I feel very honored to be joined by Mr. Chris Ryall. How you doing today,
Doing great.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Man, you are a man of many hats in the comic book industry. It seems like you've had something to do with a lot of different areas, so I've really been excited to talk to you. Um, of course, we have a mutual friend in Mr. Guy Dorian
Of course.
Sr., and Guy spoke very highly of you, so I knew I had to have you on. And I wanted to ask you to start out, how did you meet Guy? How long ago was that? And he's quite the character. So what have your interactions been like over the
He,
years? I love that
yeah,
guy.
he's great. We probably met, speaking of mutuals, we met through our mutual love of ROM Space Night here. So I'd
Awesome.
when we so for years I tried to get the rights to ROM to bring the book back, like all the old Marvel series back into high-end reprints, and over time that just wasn't going to be able to go anywhere. So we started doing, eventually we got to the point where we could do our own. So Hasbro said, yeah, you could do your own version of ROM. And as an old time fan of the series, like I wanted to bring back a lot of the guys who were responsible for working on the book that I loved. So I reached out to Sal Buscema. Sal is also a
Yeah.
mutual friend of mine and Guy's. Sal still inks Guy's work and stuff like that. And so just through all of those sort of ROM related things, we started talking about various things and projects and possibilities, and he ended up doing some ROM work with me, and that was kind of the start of things. As to the timing of when, time moves so weirdly now post pandemic or whatever that I
It really does.
5 years,
Yeah.
6 years, 8 years, something like that, somewhere in that
Okay.
range. And of late, he and I have been doing conventions together too. We went out and did a
Yeah.
signing alongside Sal Buscema a couple years ago. So yeah, we've gotten closer and hung out more, and yeah, just had a great time with him.
That's awesome. Speaking of Sal, like, I think he's just one of the most underrated legends of the comic book world. Like, obviously, everybody talks about John, his brother, but Sal, yeah, I've always loved his work, and he's like consistently very good. I think if you have an appreciation for art, like, and you see his stuff, maybe you get more out of it, whereas a casual fan sees it and maybe it's not as flashy as some of the other stuff, but it has to be surreal to get to work with Sal and interact with him and everything. I know it would be for
Yeah,
me.
because he was one of the foundational artists of my childhood love of comics, and so
Yeah.
he drew everything. He was drawing Spider-Man and Marvel Team Up and Rom and Hulk, sometimes in the same month, and so I was
Yeah.
buying just about every Marvel comic, and so there was constantly just new Sal work coming my way, and so just the sheer abundance of it, and then like you say, the consistency of his style, um, just made him just such a, I don't know, a prominent figure in my, like I say, my love of comics. And so yeah, getting to work with him,
Yeah.
he once told me that I'm, among the best editors that he's ever worked with. Like just stuff like that makes it,
Oh,
yeah, it
wow.
just feels so rewarding to, the child in me that just grew up loving that guy so much.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about that child and take it back to when you were getting into comics as a kid. And I'm guessing I'm going to have a lot of the same loves as you as far as the artists from that time. But tell me about that. Like, do you remember what your first interaction with comics was, and in kind of those earlier days of collecting, or just, I guess, maybe so much back then, people didn't really collect in the sense that they do now. Like, books were more well loved and used
Well,
than they
and
are
more
now.
well read
They didn't
too.
go straight into a bag,
Yeah,
right? And there
well,
was there was no bags and boards so
it's funny
much.
we talk about that sometimes where it was I probably just the relative lack of abundant materials that we have available now that got us just reading comics over and over again. So like some of these, like the top
Yeah.
two I didn't buy off the rack, those predate my getting into comics, but certainly Rom,
Oh
like I
yeah, I
was,
see some Kirby.
yeah,
I
yeah,
see
yeah,
some Kirby Fantastic Four up
that's
there.
right, yeah.
Speaking my language. That's speaking my language with
Yeah,
that
so
one.
my first exposure to Marvel comics, well, to comics in general, was through a Fantastic Four issue. It was post Kirby. It was issue 130, so it had this great Jim Steranko cover of the
Oh,
Fantastic Four fighting the
Steranko.
Frightful Four, and just seeing. I don't know, a single image showing a guy made of sand fighting a guy made of rock, and there's a guy on fire flying in the background, and a guy stretching his arm around and punching somebody, and it was just like, I don't know what this is, but I just want more. I want it all the time, and so that sort of just
Yeah,
started a very, I was probably, I don't know, four. And it was a
right.
neighbor's comic, and eventually I ended up taking that comic home with me because I'm like, they're not going to love it the way I do, and so then it just just like you say, I got into collecting comics real quickly after that, and just started. I was a Marvel kid, and so for the first few years of my life, like all I read were Marvel comics,
Yeah,
up until like Crisis, or just before Crisis at DC brought me into the
yeah.
DC world. But it was probably George Perez, who was a childhood favorite of mine, who
I was gonna say, yeah, Perez was amazing. His work during that time was just
Yeah,
phenomenal.
so I followed him from like Avengers and Fantastic Four at Marvel over to New Teen Titans at DC, and then that got me sort of paying attention to the wider offerings of the comic world beyond just Marvel.
Yeah. So when you were a kid, I know you talked a little bit about how they comics were read more than maybe they are now. Like I know my dad, when he was a kid, he was the oldest of eight kids, and he had a nice collection. That was actually how my dad pretty much learned how to read, kind of taught himself to read better through reading
Hmm.
comics, which is really cool. And you know, I was going to ask you, if your collection, do you have anything from when you were a kid? Because my dad, when they moved up to Washington State from California, they left his collection in a storage
Hmm.
shed, and then they went back and it was
Oh
gone.
man,
And my dad's in his, early
hmm.
70s, so there was some pretty cool
No
stuff in
doubt.
there.
Yeah, lots of
And
Silver Age.
he actually tried to take care of it and not
Hmm.
bend them and stuff. And what it ended up being was that his mom had actually thrown him
Which is
out
just
and
that
then just
nightmare story
said,
you hear over and over again.
yeah,
Like my mom was the one who sort of fostered my love of comics and
oh,
encouraged it. And
nice.
so even when I first moved out, like they let me keep the comics there for a while. Eventually they were like, "Hey, you got to get all these long boxes out of here." So I've got the comics from my childhood that still matter to me. I sold
Okay.
like 75% of my collection earlier this year just to kind of make room because I'm still making new comics. I'm still constantly buying old comics because mostly
Yeah.
now I just like stuff that looks good on the spinner racks. Um,
Yep.
but it piles up quickly, and so I wanted to get it
It
to it.
really
And
does.
like there's stuff that I own in comic book form, trade paperback, hardcover, omnibus, digest, like every possible size. And so it's starting to occur to me that like I don't necessarily have to have every possible format.
Yeah.
Some of it I read digitally too. And so I just started paring down some of the stuff. But like the stuff I kept is the stuff I loved at age 12. It's not even the stuff that has any real
Yeah.
value to it. But like I'll sell old X-Men's, but not my old Shogun Warriors. So my
Oh,
priorities
yeah.
are askew. But it's like just still that stuff that resonated as when you were a kid that matters the most.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the thing. I think with collecting, like at least for me, it's getting stuff that I love. So right now I'm paring down my
I
collection
can
too. I have
tell.
way too much. Yeah, well this is
Yeah,
nothing. This is just my art studio slash podcast
yeah.
studio. But yeah, and we'll talk about IDW a little bit later, but I counted before we got on here, there's 17 IDW artist
Mm.
editions, probably working on trying to collapse that shelf over there. But with my collection, I stopped collecting for a period of time. And then here within the past year or two, I got back
Mm.
into it. So now I'm in that same process, like you were talking about, kind of paring down and then going out and finding that stuff that I love. And for me, it's a lot of the Kirby stuff. So my eyes lit up when I saw that Fantastic Four because I'm working on kind of completing as much as possible that run. So I wanted to ask you, was Kirby a big influence on you? Do you enjoy Kirby stuff?
Yeah, I mean, his was some of the earliest stuff that I saw, in a book called Origins of Marvel Comics,
Yeah,
stuff like that. Like, I didn't grow up on his stuff other than in reprints, so I knew it for like what it was. But John Byrne and George Perez were like sort of the guys that I most
right.
loved as a kid, and I was aware of what Kirby was doing and how good he was. But like I said, it's the stuff that sort of you take into your house as your own. Like it was the stuff that I
Yeah.
paid 25 cents for became mine, and so it mattered more than old reprints of
Right.
my brothers or stuff like that. But certainly, like Kirby is, yeah. I mean, he is sort of the be all end all of the Marvel universe in that regard.
So for me, I didn't gain an appreciation, like a great appreciation for Kirby until more recently when I started collecting
Mm.
again. And I had listened to a couple of podcasts where people were going on and on about Kirby. And I started to, I'll tell you this, as somebody who's drawn for most of their life and done artwork, I didn't like Kirby stuff back when I was younger, and I thought because it looked wrong,
Mm.
right? Like to me, I'm like, oh, the anatomy's wrong, this and that, and then over the years, as I've matured more and I have developed a deeper understanding of art, I'm like, oh, he got to such a point of mastery that he could start breaking the rules and come up with this very exaggerated style and do his thing and make things very exciting.
Everything
And I
was
don't think
exciting with
people,
Kirby. A character
yeah,
sitting there was exciting. Uh,
yeah, everybody was emoting like, crazy facial expressions, big crazy perspective
yeah,
shots.
yeah.
That was literally every book he worked on.
Yeah, no, he
And
and like you say, I've sort of grown more and more. Like early on, I didn't really see his stuff, but after I don't know, probably age 10 or 12, like I was on a steady diet of Kirby's also, and so there's a lot of guys like
yeah,
I don't know if you were reading comics like in the late '70s or something. There were some of the older guard that weren't necessarily doing their best work, because their best work was behind them to a degree. So like I knew Jack Davis
yeah,
from Mad Magazine, but I didn't know how good he was on EC. I knew people like Frank
right.
Springer from their mid '70s stuff that wasn't the best of what Frank Springer or guys like that could do. Carmine Infantino was doing better stuff before I was ever aware of him. And so, yeah, over
Yeah.
the years, you kind of go back and really learn to appreciate guys that you didn't really take to as a kid.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel you on that. I'm the same way. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about your path into comics and how you ended up becoming a professional in the field. And from what I researched on you, you've worn a lot of hats in the comic book industry over the years. So why don't you take me into that and how obviously you had this passion and love of comics from an early age. Did you know pretty early on that was a industry that you wanted to break into and explore?
Well, so yes and no. I mean, yes, I wanted to, but I also like I grew up in suburban Orange County in California, and so I just felt like
Okay.
the comic industry was an East Coast thing. Like it is something so remote to me. If I can't get on the
Yeah.
train and drive down, or ride down to the Marvel offices and walk into the bullpen and show my stuff or pitch my story, I don't have a chance of breaking into comics. So I never thought of comics as a thing I could do. I just thought of it as a thing I wanted to do. So from early on, I was
Yeah.
trying to make comics. I was better at sort of telling the stories than I was drawing the stories. I learned that very quickly. Um,
But you did try
oh,
to
sure,
you
yeah,
were drawing and stuff and
yeah. I mean,
everything.
for the most
Yeah,
part, I tried
nice.
to emulate people that I like. So I have a whole folder of images of like my attempt at doing, I don't know, Walt Simonson Thor, Frank Miller Daredevil, stuff like
Oh,
that.
that's awesome.
But but
Nice.
I didn't know how to get into comics, and so I started as an adult. I was a writer, but doing stuff like technical copy, writing training brochure or training videos and brochure
Okay.
copy and billboard stuff like that for the auto industry, and I just kind of hated it. So I started writing comic reviews online in the early days of people posting stuff online. I started writing
Yeah.
comic reviews, and through that got to know a few comic people. Steve Niles is one, and then Kevin Smith was another. And so through them, it
Nice.
led to a couple different sort of extracurricular activities and opportunities that I jumped into just as side gigs. And then eventually, those are what led me to IDW more than any kind of practical work experience I had before that.
Gotcha. So that was kind of the path, kind of getting in there, doing a few things, and then making those connections. And this seems to be a very common theme with everybody I have on here, whether it's an artist or writer. They always talk about kind of that path. They started making those connections, and then one thing leads to another, and boom, all of a sudden it's kind of surreal, and they realize they're working as an
Well, because
industry
because you know what
professional.
it is. It's not a path as much as just like these weird stepping stones you're like leaping from and trying not to like Indiana Jones gets shot by the poison arrows that are potentially,
Yeah.
because like if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, there's a path, like there's a brick road you follow, and that's how you get into. In comics, like there's so many different ways to do this that there's no, like I sometimes do these breaking into comics panels, and they're sort of bullshit because nobody's story is the same, and there's all kinds of
Yeah.
ways in, and there, if you just make a comic on your own, it's maybe not making you the riches you want, but that's what it takes to get into the comic industry. And so it doesn't require schooling, it doesn't require all the sort of official steps that some careers have, which makes it both better and worse in that regard, because it's hard to
Yeah.
recommend that anybody else follow what you did, because what a lot of people do is just unique to their experience.
Yeah, it's the whole this is a way, but it's not necessarily the way because it's different for everybody who gets
I
in
broke
there.
in as editor in chief at IDW, and that's stupid. Like nobody breaks in as editor in chief if they're going to work on, like, you start as like the assistant and the editorial assistant and then assistant editor, and you work your way up that way. And so
Yes.
it really is just a endless number of ways into this business. And so mine happened to come from some work I did with Kevin Smith that led me to meeting Steve Niles, who just called me one day and said, "Hey, there's an opening for the editor in chief job at IDW," which is, he was the guy that was kind of their superstar writer at the time. And so
Right.
brought me in for an interview. I talked to them, and soon after I was packing up and moving from LA to San Diego to take the job. The funny thing about the timing of it is that was the same week Kevin Smith offered me to be the proprietor of his comic store. He was opening a second Jay and Silent Bob shop in
Oh man.
Westwood, California. And so literally the same week I was offered to be a comic retailer and a comic publisher. And so, this one side was going to offer me the chance to actually make comics. And so that was a thing I would have
Yeah.
always wanted to do. So that was the path I took.
I think you made the right choice, but the other path would have been pretty cool
For
too.
about 6 months. I don't think the shop lasted that long because
Exactly.
Westwood was a
Yeah.
crazy expensive area, so that's a tough area
Well,
to
and
make it
just
work.
in just comic shops in general, it's a very tough industry to be in
Yeah, I
and
mean,
keep the shop
there was a
alive.
romance to it. Like I love the idea of talking up the comics I love and sort of doing what I can. It's like when you go to a comic shop that isn't necessarily run the way you think it should be or that you want it to look. And so you're like, if I ever
Yeah.
get my own store, I'm going to be able to do all these things. And so there was an appeal to that, but it was more appealing to me to be able to have a direct hand in actually making comics.
Yeah. So then you end up being the editor in chief at IDW through this choice and this branch in the timeline that you
Yeah.
chose to take. So like you said, you didn't have necessarily the quote unquote normal progression of working your way up to that position and maybe getting these different experiences before you were put into that role. What was that like? Did you adapt pretty quickly? Was it kind of trial by fire, or did the passion and the excitement of being in there and being able to work in comics and do this kind of level out or override a little bit of
Yeah.
that
I mean,
anxiety?
I think passion and all of that is worthless without any kind of practical know-how. And so I was
Yeah,
excited to do so, but I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So the outgoing editor in chief, Jeff Marriott, was there for a couple days and then gone. And so it really was a matter of like I would occasionally call him and be like, "Hey, man, I don't know how to do anything." And once you leave a job, like your interest in helping the next person sort of greatly diminishes. But he was
yeah,
nice about helping me sort of find my way. But it really was just it was easy enough that there weren't so many titles. There were 6 or 7 titles a month at most, and so that was
yeah,
a manageable level as the editor, and then as the editor in chief, helping figure out what to publish going forward. So that part I was able to muddle through and get my legs under me. The thing that helped the most was the job with Kevin Smith. Was I was the editor in chief of a website of his, this pop culture website called
oh,
Movie Poop
okay,
Shoot. And through that
yeah, I
site,
remember
yeah, so
that.
not only did I get to know people like Steve Niles, but I got to know a lot of other comic professionals, but also got a good handle on producing content on a very regular, regimented basis. And so I came into
Yeah,
it sort of knowing how to meet tight schedules and pivot when somebody doesn't come through and you need to, fill the gap or bring in somebody else to pinch hit and all that. And so again, it was weird. It was like this little side job was such a better foundation for working in comics than all the other, schooling and work experience that I had up to that point.
Yeah. I always, when I talk to somebody, I try to not make the assumption that the audience has the knowledge that I have on the
Yeah.
subject, because I'm such a geek about everything to do with making
Mm.
comics. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of tell the listeners what the job of an editor in chief is in the role of working for a comic book company, because I think a lot of people don't really understand what that means and the duties that are there for somebody in that
Yeah,
position.
and it varies from company to company, certainly. Like the editor in chief at Marvel has a whole different array of responsibilities than I had at IDW, where I was employee seven. And so there was no real marketing person, there was no real PR person. So I was essentially running the publishing line, working with the publisher, Ted Adams, who's one of IDW's founders. But we were figuring
Okay.
out what we wanted to publish. I would put together the creative teams and sort of do the sort of big picture stuff, which is figuring out what is this title going to be, how many issues, what's the larger storyline, who are we going to hire to put this book together, and then I was also doing the sort of nuts and bolts editing, the copy editing, the line editing, the working the scripts over with the writer, getting pages in from the artist, moving them to the letter and the colorist. So all the different pieces of assembly before the book is given to a production person to letter and then assemble it. But I was basically
Right.
running all parts of what the publishing line entails, which is not only figuring out what you're going to publish down the line, but also keeping the current books that you are publishing on time and getting out the door every month and all of that. And then also I was writing press releases. I was, doing the marketing. I was doing whatever meager social media we had at the time. And then also we were starting to get more into licensing. So there was a bit of licensing work on that in that
Yeah.
regard too, going out and pitching companies on why we should be able to take on licenses like CSI or Transformers, things like that.
That's what I wanted
Yeah.
to ask you about next, because I saw that you had involvement with getting some of those licensing deals with Transformers, and I think Ninja Turtles as
Yeah,
well, if I remember correctly.
hundreds along the way, yeah. And so some of the biggest work,
Yeah.
the most transformational one, and no pun intended, was Transformers. Like at that point, IDW was doing horror comics, sort of built on the back of 30 Days a Night, which is the company's initial success. And so it was
Yeah.
largely a horror publisher doing little bits of license work like CSI Comics and Joss Whedon's Angel. Um, but something like Transformers was so far afield from what the company had done that, there was a lot of talk of like, should we do this? Should we not? Is this going to sort of be seen as a betrayal to all the horror fans who are essentially buying
Right.
everything that the company put out at that point? And the answer is kind of yes, but also we can't worry about that because eventually being a niche publisher is going to very much limit what you are and how you grow and if you grow. And so something like Transformers felt like a way to make people aware of IDW as a company, bring in a
Yeah.
whole different fan base, help attract retailers and consumers in ways that new unproven titles wouldn't. And it checked every box of something that was going to be a very big sort of impactful thing to do for the company. Uh,
Yeah, I remember that was kind of my jumping on
mm,
point, and when I gained an awareness of IDW, because as a kid, Transformers, that was like one of my favorite
mm.
cartoons, and obviously I have the Transformers
I
shirt
see that.
and I still have my most of my original G1
Mm.
toys. I sold some of them when the first movie came out, but the first live action movie. But yeah, that was my first kind of. I had a minor awareness, like you were saying. I remember Angel and some of those books. But yeah, Transformers was the big one for me that got me on board and got me starting to buy some of those titles from IDW. I remember, I believe, wasn't Pat Lee the artist on
No,
that
Pat Lee was the
first?
guy who did the
Or was
series
he
at
that?
Dreamwave.
That was Dreamwave, right? That wasn't I, but I have the IDW ones.
We reprinted
I
that stuff
can't
somewhere
remember.
along the way, some of the Pat Lee stuff.
Yeah,
Some of the Dreamwave stuff was never finished. Some never got reprinted because they
I
didn't
think
pay
I
the
might
creators,
have.
stuff like that. So,
I think the I think I have the Dreamwave Pat Lee
mm.
stuff, but I think I have those reprints as
And Pat
well.
Lee, like, and his team were completely instrumental in getting like the fandom excited about Transformers again. But
Yeah,
they also sort of took their eye off the actual running of the business properly, which eventually it came to a halt. And at the time we
yeah,
talked about do we pick up where they left off because those fans were just left hanging? But ultimately, it became a matter of like, well, there were too many people that we don't know if they were paid for their work. In some cases, we know they weren't, and so I didn't want any
Right.
part of anything that sort of mistreated those creators. And so we thought we got to start fresh and start new, and start with an issue one, which is always harder to build an audience again because they were like, well, we just got emotionally invested in the Pat Lee stuff, and now it died. So why should we care about another version? And of course, now
Yeah.
we're in an era where there's another version of a thing you love
Yeah.
every year. But at the
Yeah.
time, like people were resistant to a new version of Transformers. But
Yeah, I remember
yeah,
that.
but it went over fine mostly.
Working with creators has to be challenging in a sense because I know a lot of creative minded people don't always understand how business runs in the create from a creative perspective. We have things we may want to do that aren't necessarily in alignment with what needs to happen for the company or the business. Do you find any challenges with that, like in working with creatives, just as a broad generalization?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I mean, the Pat Lee's kind of an extreme example of a creator who is very good at creating, but not necessarily adept at running a company in the long term. But
Right.
certainly, like people that are more creative minded are focused on making stuff as they should be, and so it's the publisher's job to help guide them, sort of help protect them from their own worst instincts, help guide their better instincts, and hopefully all work in unison toward just making cool stuff. I've always written too, so I've always written comics on the side because I felt it was. I mean, not only did I want to, but I felt it was important to also keep a foothold in the creative side and on the publishing side,
Yeah.
so you can sort of more authentically speak the language to creators and know what they're going through. I tried coloring comics just to get a sense of like what I'm asking somebody. If I'm asking you to color 5 pages tonight, how much work am I actually asking of you? And I feel like it's important to know
Yeah.
what you're asking instead of just trying to get people to get your work done so you can check off a box or something. Because I time moves differently when you're drawing a regular paycheck within the walls of a publisher and you're a freelancer just hustling to get by. And I mean, I certainly appreciate that even more now as that's been my life the last few years. But yeah, it's always been important to
Yeah.
me to sort of help manage creators in the way that's going to help facilitate the best comics. Because otherwise, if everybody feels like they're being grinded down by tight deadlines or people nitpicking everything or just, otherwise on their ass, like that's not the best way to make anything cool. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think having that
uh,
love of it and the understanding that at the end of the day, we're trying to make
uh,
something cool that appeals to the fans is a very important factor
yeah, and
there.
the more you can sort of protect the fans from that information, and like we're in a world like where everybody knows everything about everything now, so everybody knows like what goes on at a publisher and the business end of things and the numbers into things, and I sort of hate that because it wrecks the enjoyment of the actual comic, when they know too much about the personalities or they know about a company's upheavals or their stupidity or their layoffs or whatever, all the stuff that kind of affects like how you feel about the output is always a bummer because ultimately you want the thing you're making to be pure. And so knowing too much of what goes on behind the scenes inevitably makes it all worse. Like it's harder for me to
Yeah.
enjoy some comics now just because I know
I
too
bet.
much. So
Yeah.
you revert back to this stuff, the stuff you love as a kid when it was just a pure love of what comics were.
Yeah, and things have changed so much now because earlier in our conversation, you were talking about how like you didn't necessarily think it was feasible to break in because back in those days, you did have to move to the East Coast and physically go into the Marvel office or DC to try to show your work or break in. Now the access is so broad, like there's through social media and everything else, you see a ton more creators, a ton more people trying to break in, and it's completely changed the dynamic, and like you said before, there's not necessarily a single way to get in, so necessarily doesn't mean because there's so much more access or exposure that people are going to be able to get in. So if you had advice to give to somebody trying to break into comics in the landscape that we're in today, What would that
Well,
be?
so just to quickly go back to my sort of self mythologize about like I was so far away from comics. I was on the
Right,
West
right.
Coast. Like, yeah, that's true. Like I couldn't just hop on the train and go to Marvel, but it's also kind of a bullshit like excuse for not trying, like other people
Right.
submitted stuff through the mail and broke in or got rejected. And so I think part of me as a kid telling myself I could never break in because I'm not proximal to Marvel's offices on Madison Avenue is a way of like not trying and so not failing. And
Yeah.
so
Self-limiting
yeah,
beliefs.
and so right, it is kind of. I wish I had taken more shots younger, than I
Yeah.
did. But anyway, I don't know. For people today, it's you're right. Like I had some of the best people and my closest friends and the people I love working with the most live in Australia or Chile, and so it's democratized the availability of talent around the world. But what that means is you're also now competing with the entire world. So that
Way
also is
more.
makes it a lot
Yeah.
harder. So advice to people trying to break in is just make stuff on your own and don't ask for permission, which kind of goes back to me sort of wanting to have permission as a kid to like pitch knowing I'm not going to have to suffer through rejection, which is stupid because so much of this
Yeah.
making stuff is rejection, and it's actually healthy,
100%.
but
Yeah. Rejection and failures,
yeah,
right? Like messing
completely.
up and adapting and moving forward.
Not
Yeah.
everybody should break in their first effort or their 10th effort, like sometimes you need seasoning, you need to figure out how to tell stories well. But now I nobody that is at a like a Marvel or DC or even like I don't know, probably the top 5, top 10 publishers is going to hire somebody who's never made a comic before. So I would say
Yeah.
focus less on drawing Spider-Man at the start and focus more on making some proof of concepts of your own, telling your own stories, and then if you
Show that you can do the work
yeah, and
and
also getting a
yeah.
sense of like you say what it takes to make a comic, and to finish a comic. It's really easy to start comics, but it's hard to finish stuff, and so finishing things is almost more important or equally as important to honing your actual artistic chops because there's
Yeah.
a billion abandoned projects that are off to a really good start that people got busy with the next thing or got excited about the next thing and just abandon, and then it gets easier just to quit when you don't sort of keep your head down and just see something through to the end.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you've kept yourself involved with creating comics and you write. So, take me into some of the work. I know you did some stuff that was published. Didn't you have a publishing company under the Image
Yeah, I still
imprint
do.
or something you did? Okay, you still do. All right. So let's talk a little bit about that and writing and some of the work that you've done that people may be familiar with that's out there and has come out in the
Yeah,
past.
so the first thing I ever had published was something people would probably be more familiar with from the film than the comic. Is I adapted Shaun of the
Okay.
Dead to comics.
Oh,
And so my
nice.
first handful of published comics were adaptations of other things. I adapted George Romero's Land of the Dead. I adapted Clive Barker's Great and Secret Show to a long form graphic novel. I adapted.
So you and I was gonna say you and Guy probably have bonded a little bit over horror
Oh yeah,
stuff.
absolutely we have. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of the same childhood loves and adult loves of
Yeah.
Romero and King and people like that. In fact, I adapted a couple King projects. So I adapted a
Oh
lot of
wow.
different things, and I did things like most things that I do on my own either involve zombies or robots or aliens. And
Okay.
so I did a book called Zombies versus Robots, and I did an alien series called Groom Lake with artist Ben Templesmith. I did a
And a UFO nerd like me knows what Groom
yeah,
Lake
yeah. I mean,
is.
I'm a big
Some
UFO
other
nerd,
people might
so
not.
yeah.
Yes, yes, me too.
And so yeah, a lot of the stuff I've done has been along those lines. I co-wrote the ROM series that we did. I co-wrote a Kiss comic. I wrote a Weekly World News comic. So, a lot of goofy-ish things. Like I like stuff that sort of doesn't take itself over serious for the most part.
Yeah.
And so when I left IDW in 2020, yeah, Image offered me an imprint. So my partner on Zombies vs. Robots, Ashley Wood, he and I started this little imprint called Syzygy, where we do some of our own stuff. We publish other people's works. Like we led off with Joe Hill's Rain, which is adapted by David Boer and Zoe Thorogood, and have done a number of books along those lines. Stuff that I don't know, it's kind of like a pleasantly off kilter vibe to it. Like I we try to do stuff that doesn't feel like it could be published at any number of other publishers. It's sort of stuff that is
Yeah.
very much our own sort of, like I say, off kilter sensibilities.
Nice. So going back a little bit, speaking of writing adaptations of existing properties, I have to imagine like there's going to be some restrictions and challenges in place when that occurs. So do they just give you a basic outline of what things you can change or adaptations you can make to the source material? Is it restrictive, or do they give you some creative freedom when you're doing that
I mean, it
process?
depends on the person involved, or in some cases, the studio involved. Some studios,
Like Simon Pegg's like a comic guy, right?
yeah.
Like
So is
he's big
Edgar.
into
So I
comics.
met with
So
Edgar Wright early on, and we talked about what the comic could be and who the artist would be. And I mean, the movie existed, and so I basically worked on that when I worked from the screenplay, and so it's a pretty straight adaptation of the
gotcha.
film. But like when we did Great and Secret Show with Clive Barker, Clive is a guy who doesn't always over describe what's going on. He leaves a lot of like the horrors and the monsters and things like that in people's imagination. So I was asking, well,
Yeah.
I now need to sort of visualize this thing that people have only seen in their imaginations in actual comic book form. He goes, "It's
Yeah.
your book. Make it what you want. Do whatever you want." And so
Nice.
he was incredibly encouraging and positive about us sort of taking whatever liberties. Same with Stephen King. There were things with Stephen King's project where he said, the book already exists. Go make something new. Go make something cool. I'm doing that with
Yeah.
I'm adapting a version of Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis right now. That's
Oh,
different from the
amazing.
film. Even from the starting point is different from the film. But he very much said, rewrite me, add stuff. Do whatever you want to do to make it work in this form. And so a lot of cases when you work with a singular creator, you have way more flexibility than when you work with a studio where there are
That's
levels
what,
upon
yeah.
levels, and you eventually get to levels that don't know what comic books are other than they see them as a marketing tool, and so they don't
Yeah.
want any variance from the original thing. And you try to go, well, no, this isn't going to hurt the original thing. It needs to be its own thing, or else why would fans care about it? And so sometimes you're
Yeah.
like educating them as you're also trying to do something with a little bit more, creativity behind it.
Right. Did you ever pick up Jack Kirby's older, he did that adaptation of 2001 Space Odyssey?
Absolutely, I did. Yeah, that.
Man, he created a bunch of new new stuff in
Well,
there,
that and Black Hole
because he
too. Like
was,
he made both of those so much
yeah,
more exciting than they are to watch.
totally. Yeah, I know they gave him like a little some of the script and things, and he just went to town with his creative
Amazing
imagination. And
stuff.
there's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
there's shots in there that, stuff that wasn't in the movie at all, but just really adds to it, I
yeah.
think.
Because otherwise, especially now when you can rewatch stuff endlessly, like adaptations in graphic novel form don't really have as much purpose as they did. Like when we were, I don't know, reading Star Wars comics, because that was the only way we could re-experience the Star Wars film. So now they need
Yep.
to be their own thing. They need to be something special and unique and cool and different from the novel or the film, because otherwise, like I said, then they don't really have a reason for being.
Yeah. Now I saw recently something that I probably shouldn't have seen because I want to buy
Mm.
it. You did like a big Conan book recently. Tell me a little bit about that. Is that like an artist edition type thing, or what is
Yeah,
it? I saw it was a big format, so I'm like, okay, how many more books can this shelf hold before it
yeah, I know that.
collapses?
Yeah, so that's coming out from a company called Pug, which is some former IDW people and Marvel's former publisher John Nee. And so I just sort of came in
Okay,
from the sidelines. They already had this thing up and running, and they asked me to write text pieces for the book. And so it's an artist
nice.
edition, but it features a lot of different artists. And so what I did was just contribute text bits that explain why John Buscema and Barry Windsor Smith and Gil Kane and on and on and on, all these different Conan artists, why they were important, why their work mattered, and what were some of the sort of the landmark things that they did along the way while working on that book, just to help put all the different art in context. Yeah,
Nice. So there's Buscema and Windsor Smith stuff
lots of
in
different
it.
people. Yeah, even
Oh,
some more
geez.
modern pieces like from Art Adams and Jim Lee and stuff like that. So yeah,
Nice.
it's like a greatest hits of Conan artists.
Very cool. Now, currently, what's your most recent stuff that you're working on that you have percolating and getting ready to go? Are you doing more writing and in publishing? Like there was something online. Do you have publishing called Ryall Time or something like
Oh no, that
that?
was
Or
I had a
okay,
Tumblr a long time ago that I called Riley, and all that was
gotcha.
is like playing off of there was
You
an annual
know,
episode called Smile Time, so I was like, I don't know, I'll call it
yeah.
Rile Time. Like it was,
You know what drives me nuts sometimes is now Google always pulls up that AI
oh
response
yeah,
on
I know,
things.
yeah.
And that was one of the things it said, but then I couldn't find it anywhere else. So I figured it was probably
Well, and
wrong, but I wanted
but
to
I did
ask you
also did
about
a
it.
radio segment for a while, like a regular feature on this radio show called Fictional Frontiers. So I had a little Rile Time
Okay.
segment. Um, but no, so beyond the imprint and the one-offs like the Conan book and the Francis Ford Coppola project, so I'm an editor at large at Abrams, so I'm doing a number of books with Abrams. One of which
Okay.
actually, I'm glad we're talking right now, and I actually brought a
Yeah.
prop. Um, but
Oh,
I did
awesome.
a collection of these great old Marvel calendars,
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
and so this book comes out November 12th, and it's like all these cool old Marvel calendars that have never really been reprinted in any form. And so,
Oh, that's
they did cool
amazing.
stuff even with the grids, not just the artwork. And so it's a
Yeah.
big 13 by 13 hardcover. So that comes out on the 12th. So I've sort of also entered like my archival period. So I'm doing bits of archival work where this came out in October. I did speaking of origins of Marvel Comics, I did a deluxe edition of
Yep.
this book. And so this is a reissue of the original, but with like 60, 70 added pages of essays,
Oh, very
original
cool.
art, sort of concept art, unique pieces, contribution of people like Larry Lieber and Alex Ross and others. And so yeah, just doing all kinds of things to try to stay busy and relevant
Yeah.
in the industry still.
A man of many hats, like I said
It can
earlier.
feel like too
It
many
seems
at
like you
times,
got,
but yeah, it's
yeah.
like I say, it's definitely a scramble as a freelancer compared to the relative security until there is no security at a publisher.
Yeah.
But you also learn at a publisher that it's not really security; it's kind of the illusion of security until the whim changes or whatever
Right.
it is. So now it's fun to be able to just like cast about in lots of different directions.
Well, and I find that, creative minded people often we have to keep those creative brains busy. Otherwise, like too much downtime, too much time to think can start to lead to some issues. So like for me, I know I always feel better if I'm constantly keeping myself doing something, even in my off time when I should probably be resting or whatever, like I find too much rest kind of makes me complacent and feel
I don't want to
anxious.
be alone with
So
my thoughts. Like if I could have a movie on and
no,
music
man.
playing and a podcast going and
Yeah.
writing and chatting, whatever I can do to sort of keep these voices out and let other voices in is fine with me. So
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you there, definitely. Well, I want to give you a chance to let everybody know where they can find you online, where they can see stuff that you've worked on, if you have a website or best places on social media. Why don't you let everybody know where they can find you, and I'll make sure to put it in the show notes as well. And any other stuff that you want to make sure you get out there and let people know. Now's the time. You have the
all
stage.
right, yeah, let's
Let
see.
everybody know.
So I'm on most socials at Chris_Ryall, um, which is where I don't know. I've definitely dialed back the social media a bit. I think after the like Twitter implosion, everything else, it just all started
Right.
to feel like more effort. But at the same time, like as a largely a solo act, like I need to sort of keep spreading word on everything too. So I also have a Substack newsletter that I do weekly ish where I talk about old comics, new stuff I'm doing, and I actually show off different themes that have been repeated in comics, in the form of a
Oh,
spinner
cool.
rack column, I call it, where I'm showing, all like, I don't know, floating heads or characters
Right.
backed up against a brick wall or, just stuff like that. And so just trying to sort of have fun with all the comic knowledge in my head. Um, I have these Marvel archival books are just out. I've got a horror one shot called Dread the Halls that me and a writer, Jordan Hart, and a handful of different artists have done. That's like a Christmas horror one shot, like this extra length comic coming out in early
Oh,
December. And
sweet.
so, keeping the imprint alive with new stuff, sort of doing these new editions of older stuff, and I don't know, everything in between. The one thing I don't have is a proper website. Like we have a World of Syzygy website, but it's, also as a solo act, it's just hard to keep everything updated
Yeah.
at all times. And so I don't have the greatest path to actually sell my books directly. And that's something I should probably fix. Um,
One more hat to
but an
add.
important one, because it's good to not only make stuff and
Very.
just have it sit there, but also let it, get out into the world for people that want it too. So yeah,
Yeah.
all of those things.
Awesome, man. Well, listen, I appreciate you spending some time with me today, especially knowing how busy you are. I would love to have you get on again in the future and chat. I have a feeling we could get into talking comics and probably be on here for like 2 hours
Man,
if we were both afforded the time.
I'm totally
So
up for it.
I'd love to have you back if you'd like to. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. If I'm welcome back, I'd be happy to do it again.
Absolutely. Yes. Very cool. Well, listen, hang out with me here for a moment. I'm going to pitch all my stuff, let everybody know. Make sure, guys, go on youtube.com/at Nerdy Musings to watch the video version, because a lot of times people like Chris, they show awesome stuff to the camera. Yeah, there it is. Yep. He has all sorts of cool stuff that we show on here. You always get to see these people always have the most amazing like comics and things behind them. So I encourage you to check out the video version. Again, youtube.com/at Nerdy Musings. If you enjoy the show, make sure to give us a like, subscribe, share with a friend. Every little bit gets us more exposure. Can listen on any of your favorite audio podcast platforms as well. And in the meantime, everybody, keep it nerdy.